The crowd was already too loud for a Saturday afternoon. Roughly 400 people had pressed themselves into the community gymnasium on the eastern edge of Oakland, California, in the late autumn of 1967. The folding chairs along the walls were gone by 10 in the morning. People stood 3 and 4 deep against the painted cinder block. The air smelled of old mat rubber and nervous sweat. At the center of the room, beneath a pair of industrial pendant lights, a man stood absolutely still. He weighed 134 pounds. He stood 5 feet 7 inches in flat shoes. He had the kind of stillness that large men rarely manage and small men almost never achieve. A stillness that was not passivity but its precise opposite. It was concentration made physical. A wire pulled to its final inch before breaking. His name was Bruce Lee. He had been invited to give what the program described as a martial arts demonstration. He had agreed. He had arrived 11 minutes early, which was his custom. He had spent those 11 minutes standing alone near the far wall, watching the room fill, studying the geometry of the space, noting where the light fell and where it did not. No one in that room, not one person among the 400, understood what they were about to witness. And then, from the third row near the eastern entrance, a woman stood up. She was not a student of any known martial art. She had arrived with a group of educators from a local college, attending on a faculty pass. She was confident. She had opinions about what martial arts really were and what they were not. She had shared those opinions freely with the people around her for the better part of an hour. She stepped forward onto the mat. She raised her open hand, and in front of 400 witnesses on a Saturday afternoon in Oakland, California, she slapped Bruce Lee across the face. What happened in the next 47 seconds would be discussed for the rest of the century. Not because of the strike, not because of what Bruce Lee did, but because of what he chose not to do. Most people who study that moment believe they know the story. They do not. To understand what happened that afternoon, it is necessary to understand what kind of man Bruce Lee actually was by the end of 1967. Not the mythology, not the films, the man. He had been training in Wing Chun under the instruction of Yip Man in Hong Kong since the age of 13. He had arrived in Seattle at 18 with $25 in his pocket and an understanding of combat that most men 3 times his age could not approach. He had taught himself to read English at a university level. He had studied philosophy as seriously as he studied the body. He had absorbed Western boxing, fencing theory, and judo principles by the time he was 22. Not as curiosities but as engineering problems to be solved and integrated. By the autumn of 1967, he had developed what he called Jeet Kune Do, the way of the intercepting fist. It was not a style. He was emphatic on that point to the point of repetition. It was a philosophy of movement. The idea was that a style was a prison. A style told you what to do before you knew what the situation required. Bruce Lee wanted no prison. He had defeated challengers in formal matches and informal encounters going back to his teenage years in Hong Kong. He had sparred with Joe Louis, the full-contact karate champion, and had instructed him in footwork that Louis credited for 3 separate tournament victories. He had trained with fighters who outweighed him by 60 and 70 pounds and had done so without a visible trace of anxiety. His hands, by documented measurement, could travel 27 feet per second at peak acceleration. His 1-inch punch, delivered from a stationary position with 0 windup, had displaced grown men backward by distances that observers measured in disbelief and documented in writing. He was, in the considered estimate of men who had spent their lives in martial arts and had no reason to flatter him, perhaps the most purely dangerous human being alive at that moment in time. He was also, by every account from every person who knew him in a private capacity, a man of rigorous self-discipline. Not the self-discipline of suppression, the self-discipline of someone who had spent years understanding the difference between what he could do and what the situation actually required. Both of those things, the danger and the discipline, were present in that gymnasium. They were always both present. What would change that afternoon was the question of which one would answer. The demonstration had begun at 10:30 in the morning. Bruce Lee had not opened with the things that draw a crowd. He had not broken boards. He had not performed the kinds of elaborate high-kick combinations that gymnasium audiences expected and applauded. He had instead begun with something that looked, to the uninitiated observer, like almost nothing. He had asked a volunteer from the audience to stand 6 feet away and attempt to strike him. The volunteer, a young man, perhaps 23 years old, who had some background in karate and who had been asked specifically because of that background, threw a straight punch. He threw it with intention. He was not performing. He did not connect. What happened was difficult for most of the room to track with the naked eye. There was a movement from Bruce Lee that began in the back foot, traveled through the hip, expressed itself as a lateral displacement of perhaps 4 inches, and resulted in the punch passing through empty air. The young man was left momentarily off balance, reaching forward into nothing, his center of gravity ahead of his feet. In the time it took the young man's fist to complete its arc and find nothing, Bruce Lee's right hand had arrived at a position 3 inches from the young man's jaw and stopped. Stopped completely, not slowed. Stopped. The crowd registered this with a collective intake of breath that the gymnasium's concrete walls amplified into something close to a sound effect. The young man stepped back. He nodded once. He returned to his seat. Bruce Lee did not acknowledge the applause. He explained, without theatrical inflection, what had happened. He explained the geometry of it. He explained the principle of interception, meeting a motion before it fully develops, not after. He explained why distance and timing were more important than any individual technique. He was calm. He was precise. He was teaching. This went on for the better part of 90 minutes. He demonstrated the 1-inch punch. He demonstrated the efficiency of low kicks versus high kicks in an environment without performance considerations. He demonstrated the way that a trained body's natural tension could be used against it. He demonstrated the principle of simultaneous block and strike, a concept borrowed from Wing Chun and refined across 17 years of daily practice. At no point in those 90 minutes did he raise his voice. At no point did he perform anger or aggression or the theatrical version of menace that lesser practitioners used as a substitute for actual capability. He was, in the word that witnesses would use most frequently when recounting the morning, serene. And that serenity was exactly what Margaret Ellison could not accept. Margaret Ellison had been sitting in the 3rd row with 3 colleagues from the humanities faculty of a local college. She had a doctorate in education, she had opinions about the relationship between performance and reality, between spectacle and substance, and she had been sharing them in a carrying voice since approximately 10:15 in the morning. She believed, and said so to her colleagues within easy hearing range of the people around her, that what she was watching was theater. She used the word precisely and with some contempt. She said that any physically average person with sufficient nerve could produce the same effects because the volunteers were cooperating. She said the young man who had tried to hit Bruce Lee had pulled his punch. She said the 1-inch punch volunteer had fallen backward because he expected to fall backward. She was not, by the accounts of the people seated near her, an unkind person in ordinary life. She was a person who had an idea, who had committed to that idea, and who had allowed the commitment to accumulate past the point where revision was psychologically available to her. By the time Bruce Lee was 40 minutes into the demonstration, Margaret Ellison had privately decided to test her thesis. She was not impulsive. She thought about it for the better part of an hour. She watched carefully. She looked for evidence that would change her assessment and found, in her own analysis, none. At 12 minutes past noon, when Bruce Lee paused the demonstration to allow the audience to ask questions, Margaret Ellison stood up. She walked to the center of the mat. Her colleagues, in the accounts they gave years later, said they knew what she intended and did not stop her. One of them said the thought that crossed his mind was that she was probably right, that Bruce Lee would not strike a woman, that the test would simply prove the performance was conditional on cooperation. Margaret Ellison stood approximately 2 feet in front of Bruce Lee. She was measuring him, looking at him with a specific kind of academic evaluation, an attempt to locate the human being inside the reputation. She said, in a voice that the people nearest them could hear, that she thought what she had seen was impressive theater. Bruce Lee looked at her without particular expression. She said that she wanted to know what would happen if the cooperation were removed. She raised her right hand. She struck him across the left cheek with an open palm. The sound it made was sharp and flat and distinctly real. 400 people heard it. Several of them flinched at the sound before they consciously processed what had happened. The next 3 seconds were a silence that witnesses, in the years following, consistently described as the loudest silence they had ever heard. Bruce Lee did not move. This is the first fact, and it must be understood precisely. He did not step back. He did not turn his head with the force of the strike. He did not change his expression. His hands, which had been resting loosely at his sides, remained there. He absorbed the impact with a stillness so complete that several people in the room initially believed they had misread what they saw. They had not misread it. The strike had landed. Margaret Ellison's palm had connected with his face with real force. The sound was proof of that. But Bruce Lee had received it the way a stone receives rain. He looked at her. 7 witnesses who were close enough to see his eyes in that moment, 7 separate people interviewed on separate occasions over the following years, all used versions of the same word. Calm, not the controlled calm of someone suppressing an impulse, the calm of someone who had already processed the entire event before it finished occurring and had arrived at a resting conclusion. He let 4 seconds pass. Then, in a voice that the people nearest them described as conversational, genuinely conversational, not the careful modulation of someone managing themselves, he spoke. He said, "I felt that." 3 words. He said them the way a carpenter might say he felt a knot in the wood. Informational, precise, Margaret Ellison had come to that mat with a hypothesis. In the 3 seconds after the impact, watching his stillness, hearing those 3 words in that tone, her hypothesis had undergone a significant revision. She said, "You did not move." He said, "No." She said, "Why?" He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Because you gave me no reason to." The room was still processing what it had witnessed. But Bruce Lee was not finished. He had been given, in this moment, something rarer than a challenge from a trained opponent. He had been given a teaching situation from someone who genuinely wanted to understand. He recognized the difference. He asked Margaret Ellison if she would stay on the mat for a moment. She agreed. What followed was a 14-minute conversation that several people in the audience later described as the most valuable thing they witnessed that day, more valuable than any of the physical demonstrations that preceded it. He explained, not in the vocabulary of martial arts but in plain and precise language, what had happened in his body when her hand connected with his face. He explained that the impulse to respond to a strike with force was biological before it was volitional. The body registered threat and began preparing a response before the conscious mind had any role in the process. In an untrained person, this preparation expressed itself as either counterattack or flinch. In a trained person, years of practice had laid an alternative pathway. Not the suppression of the biological impulse, but the installation of a different one. He said, "The question is never what you can do. The question is what the situation requires." He said that Margaret Ellison's strike had not required a physical response. It had not put him in danger. His assessment of that was not pride or bravado. It was arithmetic. She had presented no threat to his physical safety that a moment of stillness could not absorb. Responding with force to a strike of that nature, from a person who was, by any trained evaluation, not a threat, would not have been discipline. It would have been the absence of it. He said, "Power without judgment is not strength. It is only weight." Then, he did something that no one in the room expected. He asked Margaret Ellison if she would allow him to demonstrate something. She agreed, with visible uncertainty. He asked her to stand with her arm extended forward, her palm facing him, and to hold that position with as much stability as she could manage. She did. He placed 2 fingers against her palm. He asked her to push back against them. She did, and she had a good amount of natural strength for her size. She was able to apply real force. He said, "Notice where your weight is right now." She noticed. He said, "Your weight has moved forward, into the resistance. This is what the body does when it meets something to push against." Then he removed his 2 fingers from her palm without warning. Her arm shot forward, her weight lurched. She caught herself before she fell. He said, "You were not destabilized by contact. You were destabilized by its removal." This is what most people never understand about confrontation. The danger is not always in what strikes you, it is sometimes in what stops. The room was very quiet. He said, "I did not move when you struck me because the moment required stillness." Stillness was not weakness in that moment. Stillness was the only appropriate response. Margaret Ellison stood on the mat for another several seconds. Then she nodded once, a deliberate, unhurried nod, the kind that acknowledges something real, and returned to her seat. If you have reached this point in the story and you find that it is changing the way you think about what strength actually means, you are not alone. Thousands of people who have studied Bruce Lee's life reach the same point and have the same experience. If that kind of understanding matters to you, consider subscribing. This channel explores the moments that the films and the legends omit. The moments when the real nature of a person becomes visible. There are more of them to tell. The demonstration resumed 17 minutes after Margaret Ellison returned to her seat. Bruce Lee did not reference what had happened. He did not use it as an anecdote. He did not point to it as evidence of anything. He simply continued the demonstration from exactly the point at which it had been interrupted, as if the interval had been a scheduled pause rather than an unexpected and historically significant event. This was, by the testimony of people who knew him, consistent with his character. He did not collect experiences the way some public figures collect them, as inventory for future use. He processed them in real time and released them. He was not building a case for himself. He was not gathering material. He was simply present in each successive moment, applying to each one whatever the moment actually required. The demonstration continued for another 40 minutes. In that 40 minutes he addressed the question of distance in a way that witnesses later described as the clearest explanation of the concept they had ever encountered. He called it the management of space. He said that every physical confrontation was, at its core, a geometry problem. The person who understood the geometry, who knew at every moment precisely where they were in relation to their opponent, what the available distances were, and what each distance permitted, held an advantage that no amount of physical strength could fully compensate for. He said, "A fighter who controls distance controls the options, not just his own options, the opponent's options as well. If I am always exactly where you cannot reach me, and I am always exactly where I can reach you, the outcome of the encounter is already determined. What happens afterward is only the expression of what was already true." He demonstrated this with two volunteers simultaneously. He stood between them. He moved in a pattern that kept him, at every moment, outside the effective range of one of them while remaining inside the effective range of the other. He did this without apparent urgency. He was conversational while he did it. At one point he stopped and pointed out exactly what he was doing and why, and then resumed, and the watching crowd could now see the geometry he had described, could track it in real time. And several people made involuntary sounds of recognition. He said that distance control was not a technique, it was a way of reading a situation and positioning yourself relative to it. He said it applied in rooms, in streets, in conversations, in relationships, in every area of human life where position mattered and position always mattered. After the demonstration formally concluded at 14 minutes past 1 in the afternoon, several people in the audience approached Bruce Lee with questions. Margaret Ellison was not among them. She had remained in her seat after returning to it. She had not spoken again to her colleagues in the same carrying voice she had used before. She sat for several minutes after the room began to empty. One of her colleagues, a man named David Ferris, who was a professor of sociology, later gave an account of what she said when she finally rose from her chair. She said, "I was wrong about the theater. But I was right that it was a performance. I only misunderstood what was being performed." David Ferris asked her what she meant. She said he was not performing martial arts. He was performing self-possession. The martial arts were only the vocabulary he was using. David Ferris wrote this down in his journal that same evening. He kept the journal for the rest of his life. After he died, his daughter published a collection of excerpts. This account appeared in that collection as one entry among many, without special emphasis the way real things often appear. Embedded in the ordinary texture of an ordinary day, in the weeks that followed the Oakland demonstration, accounts of what had happened in that gymnasium began to circulate in the relatively small community of people who followed martial arts seriously in California at that time. The details, as details always do, shifted in the passage from person to person. Some versions had the strike being harder, some had the room responding differently, some had Bruce Lee speaking at greater length, some had him speaking not at all, only looking. but the core of every version remained constant. A woman had struck him in public and he had not reacted with force. He had reacted with stillness. And then with teaching. The versions that omitted the teaching were the least accurate but the most popular. People were drawn to the image of the stillness, a man absorbing a public humiliation without visible response, and they interpreted it as forbearance, as a man suppressing a justified response out of social obligation or professional calculation. These interpretations missed the point entirely. Bruce Lee had not suppressed anything. The accounts of his face in those 3 seconds after the strike, the 7 witnesses who used the word calm without consulting one another made this clear. There was nothing beneath the stillness that was being held back by effort. The stillness was genuine. It was the product of 17 years of daily practice and decades of philosophical inquiry into the nature of action and the nature of restraint. He had simply, in that moment, arrived at a correct assessment of the situation and expressed that assessment physically. The assessment was, this person is not a threat. This situation does not require force. Therefore, force is not the correct response. This was not mercy in the sense of a gift given from a position of strength to a position of weakness. It was something closer to accuracy. He had read the situation precisely and responded to what it actually was rather than to what a less disciplined man might have allowed himself to feel. The fork in the road had been real, however. He had been struck. The biological reality of being struck, the cascade of chemical signals, the automatic orientation toward threat, the preparation of a physical response, had occurred in his nervous system the same way it would have occurred in any other human nervous system. He had reached the fork. He had chosen the road that the situation actually required, not the road that the injury to his pride might have suggested, not the road that the watching audience might have found dramatic, the road that a correct assessment of the situation, performed in real time with 17 years of trained perception, pointed toward. That choice, in the 47 seconds after impact, was as complete a display of his true capability as anything he had done on the mat in the 90 minutes preceding it. There is a thing that serious practitioners of any discipline eventually understand, and that most people who observe those practitioners from the outside never see. The most demanding thing a discipline asks of you is rarely the hardest version of the skill. The most demanding thing it asks of you is the appropriate version, the right response to this specific situation, calibrated with precision, deployed without excess. A surgeon who can perform the most complex version of a procedure is impressive. The surgeon's real judgment is visible when the patient does not need the complex procedure and the surgeon recognizes that and prescribes the simpler one. The discipline, at its deepest expression, is the ability to correctly read what the situation requires and provide exactly that. Not more, not less. Bruce Lee had been practicing that judgment since he was 13 years old. He had practiced the physical skills, yes, but he had practiced the judgment with equal discipline. He had asked, thousands of times, in hundreds of situations, the same question: what does this moment actually require? In the Oakland gymnasium on that Saturday afternoon, the moment required stillness. He gave it stillness. And in the giving of it, he demonstrated something that the most spectacular physical technique he had shown that morning could not demonstrate. That the capability and the judgment were not separate things in him. They were the same thing. The capability was the judgment. The judgment was the capability. Without one, the other is only potential. With both together expressed precisely, that is the thing that the people in that gymnasium recognized and could not immediately articulate but would spend years trying to. That is what Margaret Ellison meant when she said she had misunderstood the performance. He was not performing martial arts. He was performing wholeness. The martial arts were the vocabulary. The message was something older and harder to acquire. Bruce Lee died on July 20, 1973, at the age of 32. The cause, as formally determined, was cerebral edema, a swelling of the brain attributed to a hypersensitive reaction to a pain medication. He was in Hong Kong, preparing for the completion of a film. He had been in conversation with a colleague that afternoon. He lay down to rest. He did not wake up. He was 32 years old. In the 50 years since his death, his physical legacy has been studied, debated, replicated, and extended in directions that would likely have interested him more than the celebrity has. The fighters who credit his ideas, the integration of styles, the primacy of the individual over the system, the philosophy of perpetual adaptation. Run into the hundreds. The combat sports that bear the fingerprint of his thinking run into the dozens. His philosophical legacy is more difficult to trace because it did not arrive with his name attached. It arrived as an idea that made sense to whoever received it, and they carried it forward as their own understanding, which is exactly the form he would have wanted it to take. The idea was this, that the highest expression of any capability is not its maximum deployment but its appropriate deployment. That knowing what you can do and knowing when to do it are not one skill but two, and that the second is the more important of the pair. That a man who has mastered only the first is powerful in the way that a river in flood is powerful, impressive, capable of damage, but without the precision that makes power useful. The man who has mastered both is something rarer. He is dangerous when the situation requires danger and still when the situation requires stillness. And the stillness does not diminish the danger. It is what makes the danger real. 400 people were in that gymnasium on that Saturday afternoon. Of them, a specific number gave accounts that have been recorded and preserved. The accounts differ in small details and agree in the essentials. The essential thing they agree on is this, that the most memorable moment of that day was not the speed of his hands or the efficiency of his footwork or the volunteer who reached into empty air and found nothing. The most memorable moment was 3 seconds of stillness and one sentence spoken in a conversational tone. I felt that. 3 words. The calm of someone who had already processed everything that needed processing and arrived at a resting conclusion. Power does not announce itself. It does not need to. The moment that requires it will call for it clearly enough. In every other moment, the man who possesses it is simply present, simply watching, simply waiting for the question that the situation will eventually ask. He answers when asked, not before. The man who understands this is rare. The man who practices it until it becomes his nature is rarer still. The man who does so in full public view on a Saturday afternoon in Oakland, in front of 400 witnesses, and walks away without mentioning it again, that man has demonstrated something that the most sophisticated language available to us still struggles to fully name. Bruce Lee was 32 years old when he died. In 32 years he produced this, a body of physical knowledge, a philosophy of action. A demonstration of what it means to know exactly what you are and to express only what the moment requires. That is enough. In the next episode, we examine a different kind of confrontation, one that took place not on a gymnasium floor but across a table, in a room with 4 walls and no witnesses, between 2 men who had spent their lives preparing for exactly this moment and had never expected it to arrive in exactly this form. The story involves a choice made in 8 seconds that neither man spoke about publicly for 11 years. What they chose and what they did not choose and why the difference between the two mattered as much as it did, that story is waiting. Until then, remember that a river in flood and a river in channel carry the same water. What differs is the direction.